It's been a pretty big Apple year for me, but then again, there are firsts for everything. Apple themselves have shown what a first can look like with the release of their new processor, the M1. There's a lot riding on this significant change in the way that we think about our laptops, but of course, MacBooks aren't for everyone. They weren't for me until it became clear that the M1 might actually be catered towards the work side of JV. So, here it is, my first ever MacBook. I've had this for a few weeks now, and obviously I have a ton of thoughts. This is Joshua Vergara. What's going on, everybody? Here are my complaints and takeaways with the M1 MacBook Pro. I went for the MacBook Pro 13 for a few different reasons, namely because I was hoping to use it as a very nimble work laptop. But even though I have never owned a MacBook ever, I know that these first M1 laptops sport the same designs that the MacBook Pros have had for years now. Now, obviously, I'm not all that bothered by this because this is my first MacBook rodeo, but I can totally see why people are kind of miffed by the fact that everything is literally in the same place. The bezels on the screen are still rather large and could use some shrinkage, and it literally just looks like the same old MacBook Pro 13 just with a new engine under the hood. But I noticed that that doesn't deter anyone who's all about that MacBook life. Why? Because the MacBooks, the MacBook Pros, are still some of the sleekest designs in all of laptops. I'm going to get more into the actual accessories and third-party products that I use with this laptop later, but the fact remains that in a sea of large gaming laptops and PCs that I have tried to use on my lap, only to make them more into desktop replacements, it's really refreshing for me to use something that can be used basically anywhere. Obviously, I'm really excited to make this a road warrior. But one thing that I just can't shake here is the usage of the word pro. Now, that word might mean different things to different people because workflows vary from person to person. But when you're looking around the I/O, you get a headphone jack on one side and two USB-C ports on the other. That's it. There's not even an SD card slot anywhere on here, which I know hasn't been a thing on the MacBooks for a long time, but for laptops that are supposed to be for like creatives, it feels like quite the omission. Now, I know the differences between the Air and the Pro. The Pro model has a fan inside. The Pro also has the Touch Bar. And on the topic of the Touch Bar, I know that reviewers pretty much malign it for being a feature that barely solves problems that users didn't even have in the first place. But I do have to admit that there are times when it makes perfect sense. Like when I'm hitting the button up there to put focus on the address bar in Chrome or Safari, or if I'm hitting a quick mute button. And if you really think about it, with all of the touchpad gestures that I've gotten used to already, how often are you actually using the F keys? Both laptops have Thunderbolt connectivity in those USB-C ports, so it's not like Thunderbolt is really making much of a difference between the Air and the Pro. Now, Thunderbolt is really useful, don't get me wrong, but if you're looking at the term Pro in much wider perspectives, it feels like a bit of a cop-out to have to shell out more for accessories to actually achieve what the word Pro means to you. And you know what, on that topic of accessories, why don't I go ahead and shift gears a little bit, take this thing out, head over to my office, and I'll show you what a typical day actually looks like for me using this laptop. And there you go, the laptop is out of my hands because now it is connected to my desk setup here using those USB-C or Thunderbolt ports. Now, if you go in on Thunderbolt, you can really extend things. For example, you can get like a Thunderbolt solid-state external drive and you'll get some of the fastest transfer speeds. Not to mention you can do work right off of these SSDs. So Thunderbolt for me is one of the go-to things for expanding the ports and the functionality of the USB-C to the point where I can use this, again, a entry-level MacBook Pro as a full-on desktop replacement to great effect. But you don't have to rely on the usually more expensive Thunderbolt products to achieve this, and this is perfectly illustrated by one of the cooler USB-C hubs that I've used to make the desktop replacement a reality. This here is the Symbus Q by the sponsor of this video, Moshi. The Q line by Moshi brings style to many accessories that can extend your mobile capabilities, with soft material on the top that is actually covering a hidden feature that I'll reveal in a second. Now, at its core, this wall-powered USB-C hub plugs into the USB-C port, charging the MacBook Pro in particular, and now you have two USB-A ports that in my case are great for a keyboard and mouse. You have an HDMI port that can output a 4K HDR signal, and then an Ethernet port if wireless connectivity isn't cutting it. It's a simple plug and play or work situation. I just put the MacBook Pro on my stand, plug it in, and my desk setup is complete. Even better, that material on the top of the Symbus Q can be used as the resting place for any wireless charging capable smartphone. If it's an iPhone, you're probably syncing everything to the MacBook MacBook anyway, so just set it on the wireless charging surface and carry on. Now the Symbus Q comes with Moshi's 10-year warranty for added peace of mind, so you can check out the Symbus Q for laptops even beyond this MacBook Pro in the links found in the description. Thanks again to Moshi for sponsoring this video. So in a way, the way that this laptop is outfitted makes sense. These laptops are about taking the current paradigm of the MacBooks and showing how it can shift with one specific change: the processor. Honestly, the M1 is quite the revelation. Now, before you or even I get too excited, let me put this in simple terms before I explain further. For a creative like me that doesn't use many Adobe products anymore and mostly lives in Davinci Resolve, the M1 has proven to be around 80 to at most 85% as good as my PCs that rock RTX graphics cards and high amounts of RAM. While that might sound rather mundane, consider that I'm using the base model MacBook Pro with 8GB of unified RAM compared to the 32GB RAM PCs, which need at least 6 separate gigabytes of dedicated video RAM in the graphics card for my work. Whew, there's a lot of technical jargon, but basically I am really impressed with how the MacBook Pro 13 is able to still be such a viable tool compared to all of the other things that are considered very high power. The M1 is a 5nm process, making it incredibly efficient in both power and performance. On the power front, this level of efficiency means that the laptop can do basically any general productivity task for hours on end, as long as the apps are optimized for it. Case in point, I recently had a 5-hour Facebook Messenger video call with one of my old friends catching up. Now, the webcam can be way better on this laptop, but that's not the point. I started at 100% battery, and after 5 hours of video chatting, I still had around 70% left. We could have gone for way longer than that. So clearly, if you're just on, let's say, Safari or some sort of web-based program for productivity, this is the kind of longevity you can expect. So of course the library of apps that are optimized for the M1 is still a little bit bare, but eventually they can include programs that traditionally require way more power than you would expect Apple's first homegrown chip to pump out. Davinci Resolve is my prime example, as I've mentioned. The fact that I could easily move my workflow over and hit the ground running felt like a dream, especially since I was doing a lot of edits unplugged. For videos like the one you're watching right now, I could get through almost 2 whole edits on one charge, making this the kind of laptop I've dreamed of having on long flights or in a cafe without needing to hug the wall. As I said, it's like 80% of the experience that I'm used to. Scrubbing and playing in the timeline preview is a bit stuttery, and I do contend with some dips in performance, but that is considering that I'm editing 422 10-bit 4K video. Render times, though, are simply just not as fast as on my PC, but it does hit my minimum, and my minimum is that the render time is basically as long as the video itself, which is to say that it renders at basically 24 frames for my 24 frame per second projects. So clearly, if you're on Apple software more than anything else, you'll experience even better performance. Non-optimized apps that have to go through the Rosetta layer are hit or miss, but for the Adobe apps that I use, like Photoshop, Lightroom Classic, or Adobe Audition that I'm using to record this audio, my basic needs are more than met, so I'm doing fine. Once you get your workflow down, as long as your apps are supported, the MacBook Pro M1 is a tool that is really hard to pass up. But I have to admit that I have way more fun with my PCs. I mean, compare this utilitarian notebook to something like a Zephyrus Duo 15. Completely different kinds of beasts, but you get my point. That's not to say this laptop isn't fun. One thing that I'm consistently impressed with is the speakers, which for a small laptop like this has no business sounding as rich as it does. The display is up to Apple's standards, making media consumption and YouTube plenty enjoyable. And like I said, these are the situations that can go for hours and hours. Ultimately though, my favorite part about this is that this is the first laptop I've owned that I can literally bring to work, or rather, my office, and just do my thing for basically a full workday without having to touch the charger until I get home. But like I showed you earlier, I'm plugging this thing into things like the Moshi Symbus Q anyway, so I can make a desk setup that basically is juicing up the laptop all the time. Yeah, there's a first for everything, but despite how useful the MacBooks can be, I just ended up waiting until Apple's first in-house processor to try these out. The convincing performance, the long battery life, the app support for my specific workflow, and the sense of mobility just make this one of the most compelling tools I've used in 2020. And it's only going to get better from here, half because the apps will continue to get better, and half because the M1 is just the beginning. It's for that reason though that if you're a pro looking at this Pro, maybe wait for the pros that are still on their way. I've always wanted a very capable small laptop, and there are a few of them out there, but for my work, this one is it. And I think the craziest part about this journey is that now I'm keeping an eye out for whatever Apple does to follow this one up. And so there you have it, my thoughts on the MacBook Pro 13 with the M1. I can't show it to you, it's not in my hands right now because it's literally connected to my desk setup here in the office, and I'm using it to record my audio, which you've been hearing in this video in the office, of course. The MacBook Pro 13 is not the best laptop or even computer in my arsenal, but it still gets the job done quite effectively. And because it's also the most mobile laptop that I have, I can't wait to use it on some of the trips that we have once we can travel again. With all that said, I'm going to go ahead and call it on this one. Thank you so much for watching. At the very least, please drop some likes on this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Until my next video and throughout the holidays, I will just remind you to enjoy your tea, everybody.